Scott slipped into the world with a sense of disquiet and unease, as every seemingly normal aspect of life seemed a potential source of danger or ruin. The machine had never been wrong before, and a 10 out of 10 difference was something heretofore unencountered. 8 out of 10 had little chance of obeying simple, reality-defining constructs, such as the law of thermodynamics or gravity, and universes of those caliber or higher had little sense or stability to them. And yet, this 10 out of 10 universe somehow seemed precisely the same as the one he himself came from, and that disturbed him greatly. He could no better understand the implications of it as he could the difference. As he walked along a quiet suburb in New Jersey, his hometown, he watched the other inhabitants warily, but the only remarkable occurrences were the occasional wave or smile. The keen sense of unease never left him, but that was perhaps due to his own internal strife rather than anything out of place. He reached a park, one that he had played in his youth. Aside from some new swings and some trees that had somehow become more spectacular since he had last encountered them, it was much the same. As he traversed the park, he let some of his concerns dissipate, to instead give way to comfort. Regardless of the strange situation he found himself in, it was nice to be home. He had been searching for his own for so long that a different universe, no matter how strange the scale, was eminently preferable to the search thereof. As he walked, he passed an old man on a bench reading a newspaper. The man turned to look at him. 10 out of 10? The old man asked. The brief sense of comfort Scott had felt suddenly disappeared, leaving only a stark sense of confusion and fear. In all his years of traveling through multiverses, he had never encountered another like him. Finding no words to reply, he simply nodded weakly, feeling a primal urge to flee, to once more travel to some other multiverse. The old man, seemingly oblivious to Scott's fear, nodded in self-satisfaction. Aye, 10 out of 10. Spectacular day, I'd say, the old man continued. A wave of realization hit Scott, and he suddenly felt so very stupid. It most certainly is, he said, stumbling out the words. The man smiled, returning to his newspaper. Scott instead continued to walk down the path, cursing himself for his foolishness. Still, it was almost too coincidental. Regardless of his reaction, it was still a curious enough thing to investigate. He turned back to speak to the man, resolving to see what differences he could find. And yet, much to Scott's surprise, the old man was gone. His newspaper softly billowed through the air, caught on a light gust of wind. And as the cold dread began to set in, Scott was suddenly sure that something was very, very wrong with this universe. For all those years of traveling, of searching, he had never been able to go back home, and now that he'd finally found what seemed to be his exact universe, his exact world, it seemed anything but. But the knowledge that something was wrong did nothing to help him discover what was right. As the newspaper blew past him, rolling along the grass, he did his best to suppress the primal fear welling up inside of him. He knew there was simply no way the old man could have left so quickly, not even if he went at a full sprint, and regardless, he knew enough to trust his instincts and what the machine had clearly been trying to tell him. This is not home. And yet, he'd been searching for it for all of these years. He'd seemingly found it now. He wasn't ready to run away just yet. Not again. He moved with caution, ever wary, towards his home, their home. Truthfully, he did not know how long it had been, perhaps half a decade or more. Long enough for her to have moved on, to have started a new family, or worse. Still, the guilt of leaving her remained ever present, and if nothing else, he simply wanted to apologize, to let her know that he didn't run away, at least not with the intention of never coming back. As he moved towards their home, he felt an anxiety creep up within him, more visceral and overpowering than the shock of the old man's disappearance. The thought of being in some kind of copycat, dangerous world was somehow less terrifying than meeting her again, regardless of if it was truly her or not. Everything else in this world seemed precisely the same, so would she be, too? He arrived at their family home and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw no car outside. If she even still lived there, she was at least not there now. He could have time to breathe, to prepare himself. He felt a tugging at his shirt and immediately recoiled in shock. A young girl looked up at him with an inquiring expression, one foot on her push scooter. "Hey," she said with a hint of defiance. "You said you wouldn't be home till later." Scott felt every muscle in his body tense up. He looked into her eyes, eyes that he could recognize in an instant. She stared at him as defiance turned into concern. "Dad, what's wrong?" The push scooter fell to the ground as he stared into nothing, and in the silence, Scott screamed. Scott lost himself to fear, screaming until his voice became hoarse. He looked around wildly, but nothing of her remained. His daughter was gone, and with that, his courage to remain in this world. Throughout all of his travels, all danger was externalized, products of vicious world or creature, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could compare to this horror. He couldn't bear to stay any longer. And that confirmed it. He was a coward, just as he was on the day he left. A part of him knew that there was a chance that he could never return. That this damn machine was as much a method of escaping his own fears and insecurities as it was a scientific pursuit. As much as he tried to forget it, in the deepest recesses of his heart, he knew he'd abandoned her. And now he would abandon her again, if only to save her. At least, that is what he told himself. With shaking hands, he extended his palm, revealing the compact machine integrated into his lower wrist. He didn't bother inputting any kind of sensible sequence as he input numbers at random, pacing incessantly, doing anything to get him out of this world. In his haste, he tripped over the push scooter, falling to the sidewalk and landing on his elbow. Collapsed on the pavement, bleeding and fighting back tears. He finished the input sequence. Then, he confirmed departure. And then, nothing. As a car turned the corner, he knew he had no time to discover his error. He scrambled to his feet, almost tripping once again, and stumbled to the cover of a nearby house's wall. The car turned into his home's driveway, and his heartbeat beat into a blur. He leaned against the wall as every part of him shook, as he dreaded the sight of who would emerge. With a delicate step, she stepped out of the car. There was no doubt in his mind. It was her. But as the driver's side door opened, it was also him. Scott stared at himself, struggling to breathe, struggling to comprehend what was happening. The two of them walked to the trunk of the car, each taking groceries out with one hand. His other self closed the trunk, checking his phone, then looked around the suburban street, his eyes fixed on the push scooter on the sidewalk. "Allie?" Scott heard his other self call out as he walked across the street towards the fallen scooter. He leaned down and inspected it, looking around the street once more. "Allie! Allison, where are you?" Scott hid behind the wall, shaking, fighting back tears. This was a nightmare. This was hell. And he was dead. He deserved this. He deserved all of this. "Honey?" His other self continued, concern in his voice. "Can you check if Allie's inside? She left her scooter on the sidewalk." "Oh, again?" she replied, unlocking the door. "We've told her so many times." Scott was looking from behind the wall. His other self had his back turned to him, looking up and down the street. Then he glanced backwards over his shoulder, making direct eye contact with Scott. He blinked once, uncomprehending. The groceries fell to the floor. Scott reached out, almost as if to grab onto him. But he was gone, and nothing of him remained. Scott turned to run, enveloped in dread, but immediately stopped. The horizon was disappearing as clouds dissipated into nothing, a circle of silent destruction moving inward towards his home. "Allie!" he heard from inside the house. With faltering steps, Scott walked towards the door. Every step brought him closer to his home, closer to ruin. All the while, the universe collapsed in on itself. "Allie!" He opened the door, revealing his home, so different, yet so much the same. His wife came down the stairs, a portrait of concern. "Honey, was Allie?" She stopped, looking at him, regarding him in silent dread. Your clothes, honey. Your clothes, honey," she said softly. "And your hair." He waited for her to disappear. for the world to end, to wake up from the nightmare. She took one step backwards, up the stairs, as Scott stared at her in desperation. I'm just going to... She stammered, taking uneasy steps, facing him all the time. Baby, Scott whispered. I'm sorry. She turned and ran, while he stood at the doorway, pleading for it all to end. He glanced backwards, and the dissolving nothing had already reached the front porch. Their house was the only thing that remained. She started screaming, a scream of pure terror that he himself had caused. He walked up the stairs as the roof slowly evaporated, revealing stark nothing. All the while, the shrieking only grew more dire. He found her in their bedroom as the walls slowly dissolved, their family pictures dissipating into nothing. Her eyes were unfocused, as only terror remained. He was only a few steps from her. He just wanted to hold her, to tell her that everything was going to be all right. The floor beneath them dissolved, and they were left suspended in nothing as he floated towards her. He reached out and grabbed her. Fighting against her struggles, he felt her warmth, her horror. He knew if he just held on to her, it would all be okay. He could keep her safe. They could be together until the end of time. Even if the universe ended, they would still have each other. His arms suddenly hit his chest, and there was nothing left. She was gone. He was gone. Scott awoke. He blinked several times. He looked to his right and saw his wife doing her makeup. She eyed him with a smirk. Finally up, she said, doing her finishing touches on her mascara. Quite unlike you to sleep so late, Mr. Scientist. She closed her vanity mirror and stood up with a flourish. How do I look? She asked, waiting for an answer. Scott lay there in silence, and she let out a small laugh. Okay, mister, looks like you still need your morning coffee, she said, a smile still playing on her face. You'll have to make it yourself, though. I'm going to go meet Jess. She leaned over, kissed him on the cheek, and gave him a brief, quizzical look. Then she grabbed the corner of the blanket and playfully threw it over him and exited the bedroom. He slowly pulled the blanket off his face, holding it to his chest. He turned to look at the alarm clock on the bedside table. It was exactly 10:10 a.m.